Ivan the Terrible is remembered as a monster, a sadist, a madman, a tyrant. But monsters are not born. Ivan was crowned ruler of Russia at 3 years old. By 8, his mother was dead. By 13, he was already testing what it felt like to kill. This is not a story about madness. It's a story about what happens when fear is raised as a child, and later allowed to rule an empire. Before Ivan became terrifying, he was terrified.
No one is born a monster. Monsters are assembled quietly, patiently by the spaces people are forced to grow up in. Ivan Vasilievich was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow in 1533 when he was 3 years old. The ritual was magnificent. Gold-threaded vestments, incense thick in the air, voices chanting authority into a child who could barely stand beneath the weight of it. The crown did not make him powerful. It made him exposed. From that day, Ivan did not live in a palace in any meaningful sense. He lived inside a contest. The Kremlin became a sealed world of stone corridors and locked doors where men bowed to him in public and ignored him in private. The boyars, Russia's highest nobles, ruled in his name, but treated the boy himself as an inconvenience. Servants withheld food, tutors came and went. Punishments were casual, sometimes physical, always humiliating. Ivan later wrote of being beaten and neglected, not as an exception, but as routine. This was not discipline, it was domination. And children learn quickly what domination feels like when it is repeated often enough. When Ivan was 8, his mother, Elena Glinskaya, died suddenly. The official cause was illness. Unofficially, even contemporaries suspected poison. Her burial was swift. There was no investigation, no reckoning. Adults lowered their voices and avoided the child's gaze. The palace moved on. For Ivan, the lesson was not subtle. People did not simply die. They were removed, quietly, efficiently. He would remember the smell of herbs used to mask decay, the stillness of a body that had spoken the night before, the way power erased its own tracks. Death ceased to be abstract. It became practical, a thing done by those who knew how to do it without consequences. As Ivan grew older, something else became clear. He was not slow. He was not confused. He was intensely intelligent. He read scripture, law, and Byzantine imperial history with focus and hunger. He absorbed the idea that rulers were chosen by God and surrounded by enemies. Authority, he learned, was both sacred and under constant threat. But knowledge without safety does not mature into balance, it sharpens into suspicion. By his early teens, Ivan began to test what he had observed. He ordered animals thrown from the Kremlin walls. Dogs and cats fell onto the stones below, bodies breaking open, leaving dark stains that took days to scrub away. Courtiers watched in silence. No one intervened. Ivan noticed who looked away and who did not. This was cruelty, yes, but it was also rehearsal. Power meant making life stop and measuring the room's response. Violence became a language before it became a policy. In 1547, at 16, Ivan was crowned Tsar of all Rus. The title itself mattered. Derived from Caesar, it declared him absolute. And for a brief period, the damage seemed contained. Ivan married Anastasia Romanovna, and contemporary accounts describe a calmer ruler, less volatile, more restrained. He listened, he governed, he appeared, for the first time, anchored. But stability built on trauma is fragile. Anastasia fell ill and died in 1560. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned. There was no proof, but proof had never protected anyone in Ivan's world. What mattered was the pattern he believed he recognized. Those closest to him disappeared. Witnesses described his collapse, violent shaking, uncontrolled rages, days of exhaustion followed by bursts of fury. He interrogated nobles personally. Some were beaten until blood soaked through their clothes. Others were exiled. A few did not survive the questioning. Ivan watched closely. He remembered. From this point, fear and fact fused. If Ivan felt threatened, then a threat existed. The sensation itself became evidence. What is crucial to understand is that Ivan did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as surrounded. His childhood had taught him that authority lied, loyalty was temporary, and affection ended in death. To a mind shaped by that environment, the conclusion was logical, even necessary: strike first, or be destroyed. This belief did not emerge as madness, it emerged as order. By the end of these early years, Ivan had not yet created a system of terror, but he had internalized something far more consequential. He had learned to read the world as a battlefield, to interpret uncertainty as danger, and to treat violence not as excess, but as prevention. Blood, in his thinking, was not cruelty. It was insurance. This is the Ivan who moves into the next phase of his life, not a king who has lost control, but a ruler who believes control must be absolute to survive. What follows is not a sudden descent, but a continuation, an attempt to turn fear into structure, suspicion into law, and personal terror into a method of rule. Ivan the Terrible did not snap into madness. What happened next was colder than a breakdown. It was a reorganization of reality, a ruler deciding, step by step, that the only safe world is one he controls down to the last whisper. In the years after his coronation, Ivan had shown flashes of something almost hopeful. He worked with advisors, issued reforms, tightened central authority, and tried at least on paper to build a state that functioned. Even his violence had boundaries. It arrived in bursts, then receded. The court could still pretend this was a rain that might settle, but the death of Anastasia Romanovna in 1560 changed the temperature of everything. Ivan did not experience grief as loss. He experienced it as proof. He told himself she had been poisoned by the people around him, and he did what a frightened autocrat always does. He treated suspicion as certainty, and certainty as permission. From then on, the court became a place where being near the Tsar was as dangerous as being against him. Interrogations were no longer rare, and punishment was no longer symbolic. Men were beaten until their faces swelled and split. Blood was not sprayed for spectacle, it was spilled as procedure, the visible byproduct of a ruler trying to extract certainty from a world that would not give it to him. And yet certainty never came. Because paranoia doesn't want answers, it wants patterns. Ivan began to read the country as a conspiracy map. Each setback was betrayal. Each delay was sabotage. Each rumor, even trivial, became a thread you pulled until it tightened into a noose. At the same time, Russia was under enormous strain. The Livonian War dragged on, swallowing money and men, delivering victories that never felt final and defeats that felt personal. A ruler with stable nerves might have seen war as a brutal arithmetic: resources, strategy, diplomacy. Ivan saw it as something else, a test of loyalty. If the state struggled, someone must be undermining him from within. That someone was always the same category: the boyars. The boyar elite had ruled during his childhood. They had watched his mother die and carried on. They had starved him, humiliated him, treated him as an ornament. Ivan never forgot that. Now, with the throne fully in his hands, he began to replay the same story in reverse. They once controlled me, so they must still be trying. It's important to grasp the psychology here. Ivan's fear was not vague. It was specific and historical. It had names, faces, family lines. His memory turned politics into a personal ledger, and the ledger kept growing. The court responded the way courts always respond when danger becomes unpredictable, with performance. People agreed too quickly. They praised too loudly. They spoke in rehearsed piety. They stopped delivering bad news. They stopped correcting him. Every conversation became a gamble. Say too much, you sound bold. Say too little, you sound evasive. And in a system like this, evasive is practically a confession. This is how paranoia spreads. First it lives in one mind, then it becomes the atmosphere. Ivan's control tightened, but his sense of safety did not. He grew more suspicious precisely because he grew more powerful. He began to imagine enemies everywhere: at court, in the church, in distant towns that had never seen him, and therefore, in his thinking, could not truly love him. Then came the move that, in hindsight, feels like the clearest sign of what he was becoming. Not a ruler who had lost control, but a ruler who understood how to weaponize it. In late 1564, Ivan abruptly left Moscow and withdrew to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, taking treasure, holy icons, and key supporters with him. He didn't simply travel, he staged absence. He let the capital sit in dread, because dread does useful work, it makes people beg. Soon letters arrived, 2 messages that split the world in half. In one, he accused the boyars and officials of treason and corruption. In the other, he told ordinary Muscovites he still loved them, that he blamed only the elite. It was a brilliant psychological division. The people were made into his witnesses, the nobility into his defendants. Moscow panicked. The boyars and clergy pleaded. The political class did what Ivan wanted them to do. They surrendered leverage. They invited him back not as a ruler bound by custom, but as a ruler allowed to punish as he saw fit. When Ivan returned in 1565, he returned with a new understanding. The state could be remade around his fear, not hidden, not managed, institutionalized. He had tested something essential. He had learned that the country would choose stability over restraint, even if stability meant giving him the right to crush whoever he named. He had learned that if he presented his paranoia as national survival, the nation would accept it as policy. So, Part 2 ends with a transformation that is quiet on the surface and catastrophic underneath. Ivan stops trying to be a ruler who controls violence, and becomes a ruler who intends to organize it to give suspicion an office, to give punishment a uniform, to give fear a bureaucracy. Not because he enjoys chaos, but because he believes order is impossible without terror. And from this point forward, the question is no longer whether Ivan will strike. It's how he will build a system that can strike for him everywhere, all at once, and on schedule. Ivan the Terrible did not return to Moscow in 1565 as the same ruler who had left it. What came back was not simply a Tsar with greater authority, but a man who had proved something to himself, that fear could be shaped, directed, and rewarded. The city had panicked in his absence. The elites had begged. The church had yielded. And Ivan drew a conclusion that would define the rest of his reign. Power did not need to be loved. It needed to be feared correctly. From this point on, Ivan no longer treated paranoia as a reaction to danger. He treated it as insight. Suspicion was no longer a flaw in judgment. It was evidence of vigilance. Doubt was not confusion, it was awareness. Anyone who questioned this logic, he reasoned, was either naive or complicit. The court felt the shift immediately. Conversations shortened, words were chosen with surgical care. Faces became masks. Men who had once debated policy now competed in displays of obedience, hoping enthusiasm would look like loyalty. But the more exaggerated their performances became, the less Ivan trusted them. Excessive agreement felt rehearsed. Silence felt evasive. There was no safe tone anymore, only degrees of exposure. Ivan began to isolate himself, not physically at first, but psychologically. He listened less. He interrupted more. He started keeping mental records. Who hesitated, who blinked, who spoke out of turn. His memory, already sharp, turned vindictive. Years-old slights resurfaced as if they had just occurred. The past stopped being past. This was not chaos, it was internal consistency. Ivan believed the world had taught him a single lesson repeatedly. Those closest to power are the most dangerous. His childhood, the boyars, the death of his mother, the loss of Anastasia, all of it pointed in the same direction. Trust, in his experience, had never been rewarded. Control had. And control required distance. The church, once a stabilizing force, now unsettled him. Priests spoke of humility, restraint, mercy, concepts Ivan increasingly interpreted as weakness disguised as virtue. He did not reject religion. He absorbed it selectively. God, in Ivan's mind, did not protect the innocent. God tested rulers through enemies, and a ruler who failed to destroy those enemies failed God. This theological shift mattered. It allowed Ivan to see punishment not as cruelty, but as duty. At the same time, the machinery of the state began to reflect his inner world. Governance slowed. Decisions bottlenecked at the top. Officials waited for signals that never came, or arrived too late. Local authority eroded because no one wanted responsibility. Responsibility meant visibility, and visibility meant risk. Russia did not collapse. It hardened. What Ivan created was not anarchy, but brittleness, a state that functioned only when fear kept it rigid, a system where initiative died quietly, replaced by obedience. And obedience, Ivan noticed, was easier to enforce than loyalty. But obedience has a cost. Without honest counsel, Ivan's suspicions fed on themselves. Each new rumor validated the last. Each punishment justified the next. The absence of resistance did not calm him, it alarmed him. Why, he wondered, was no one pushing back? What were they hiding? This is the paradox that consumed him. The more completely he controlled his environment, the more hostile it appeared. Absolute authority did not bring certainty. It magnified doubt. Ivan's inner circle shrank. Trusted figures were dismissed, exiled, or simply disappeared from relevance. In their place came men chosen not for wisdom, but for submission. They mirrored his fears back to him, reinforcing them, amplifying them, until paranoia no longer felt personal. It felt shared. And when fear becomes shared, it begins to feel true. By the end of this phase, Ivan no longer saw himself as a ruler defending power. He saw himself as a man defending existence itself, his throne, his soul, his place in history. Anyone who threatened that, even in theory, became an enemy in fact. This is the crucial transition of Part 3. Ivan has not yet built the apparatus of terror. He has not yet unleashed it on the country at full scale. But he has completed something far more important. He has aligned his identity with suspicion. Fear is no longer something that happens to him. It is who he is. And once fear becomes identity, the next step is inevitable. A man can doubt his emotions. He cannot doubt himself. What follows is not an outburst or a tragedy of temper. It is design, the deliberate creation of a system that makes his inner logic permanent, visible, and enforceable. The reign is about to stop improvising. It is about to institutionalize terror. Ivan the Terrible did not create the Oprichnina in a moment of rage. He created it in a moment of clarity. By 1565, Ivan had stopped asking whether he was surrounded by enemies. For him, that question had already been answered. The real problem, as he saw it, was structural. Fear lived inside him, but the state still relied on old habits, custom, mediation, shared authority. Those things slowed punishment. They introduced doubt. They allowed people to hide. Ivan wanted a system that worked at the speed of suspicion. So he did something unprecedented. He split Russia in two. One part would remain the traditional state, governed by boyars and institutions. The other part, his part, would belong to him alone. It was called the Oprichnina. This was not merely a territory. It was a new logic of power, carved directly out of Ivan's inner world. The Oprichnina had its own lands, its own treasury, its own laws, and most importantly, its own men. They were called the Oprichniki. They did not dress like soldiers, they dressed like a warning. Black robes, black horses, faces severe and unreadable. Some carried symbolic objects, a dog's head to sniff out treason, a broom to sweep it away. The message was theatrical, but the violence was not. These men answered only to Ivan, not to law, not to church, not to custom. If Ivan suspected you, the Oprichniki arrived. Often at dawn. What followed was not chaos. It was procedure. Homes were entered without warrants. Families were separated without explanation. Men were dragged into the street and beaten until their bodies could no longer stand upright. Blood ran into snow and mud. not as spectacle, but as proof that authority had arrived. Property was confiscated, titles erased, lineages broken. And the most terrifying part was not the violence itself. It was the absence of criteria. No one knew what constituted guilt. No one knew how to prove innocence. No one knew when it would stop. Because the Oprichnina was not designed to punish crimes. It was designed to eliminate uncertainty. Ivan had decided that the possibility of betrayal was more dangerous than betrayal itself. The boyars were the primary targets. This was personal. They had ruled during his childhood. They had humiliated him. They had survived his mother's death without consequence. Now, Ivan rewrote history with force. Families that had dominated Moscow politics for generations were reduced to silence, exile, or execution. Some were tortured until they confessed to conspiracies that never existed. Others confessed immediately, hoping cooperation might spare them. It rarely did. Confession did not end suspicion. It only confirmed that suspicion had been justified. The terror fed itself. The city of Novgorod became the clearest example of what the Oprichnina was capable of. Ivan believed without solid evidence that Novgorod was plotting to defect to Lithuania. For a ruler governed by paranoia, belief was enough. The Oprichniki descended on the city like a ritual. Clergy were dragged from churches. Merchants were beaten in public squares. Bodies were thrown into icy rivers. Blood soaked into the streets where trade had once passed freely. This was not punishment. It was erasure. Ivan wanted to make an example so complete that doubt itself would feel dangerous. And for a time it worked. Russia fell silent. Not peaceful silent. People stopped speaking openly. They stopped warning one another. They stopped planning futures. Survival replaced ambition. Obedience replaced loyalty. From the outside, Ivan appeared powerful beyond measure. No opposition, no resistance, no visible threat. But internally, the result was catastrophic. The economy weakened as land was seized and mismanaged. Skilled administrators vanished. The army suffered. Entire regions emptied as people fled or were destroyed. Ivan had achieved absolute control and lost the ability to govern effectively. Yet even as the country suffered, Ivan did not feel safe. Because the Oprichnina had solved the wrong problem. It had removed enemies, real and imagined. But it had not removed fear. In fact, it had institutionalized it. The more the Oprichniki killed, the more Ivan suspected there must have been a reason. The more reasons he found, the more killing seemed necessary. Terror became self-justifying. At some point, even Ivan seemed to understand this. The Oprichnina did not end because Russia was secure. It ended because it had consumed too many lives, too much land, too much trust. By 1572, the system was formally dissolved. But the damage could not be undone. What Ivan had built was more than a police force or a reign of terror. He had created a model. A state where the ruler's inner fears were translated directly into law, where suspicion replaced evidence, where violence became administrative. This is why the Oprichnina matters. Not because it was uniquely brutal. History offers no shortage of brutality, but because it showed how easily a nation could be reorganized around the psychology of a single man. Ivan did not lose control during the Oprichnina. He achieved it. And in doing so, he demonstrated something far more disturbing than madness. That terror does not need chaos to thrive. It only needs permission, structure, and a ruler who believes that fear is the most honest form of truth. By the end of Part 4, Ivan no longer rules through people. He rules through mechanisms. What remains is a country hollowed out by obedience and a czar who has finally built a system ruthless enough to resemble the world he has always believed he lived in. In Part 5, we will see what happens when that system begins to turn inward, and when even terror can no longer provide the certainty Ivan craves.
Ivan the Terrible had finally built the world he believed he needed. The Oprichnina had done what it was designed to do. It had broken the boyars, it had silenced cities, it had taught an entire country to move carefully, to speak softly, to obey without hesitation. From the outside, Ivan's power looked absolute. But from the inside, something was beginning to fail. Because terror can destroy opposition. It cannot create stability. By the early 1570s, the effects of Ivan's system were no longer subtle. The country had not simply been disciplined, it had been emptied. Lands seized under the Oprichnina were often mismanaged or abandoned. Experienced administrators were dead, exiled, or too afraid to act. Local officials avoided decisions because decisions created visibility, and visibility attracted suspicion. The machinery of government still existed, but it moved stiffly, like a body afraid to flex. The economy weakened, trade routes collapsed, agriculture suffered as whole regions lost population, soldiers went unpaid, poorly supplied, and increasingly unreliable. This was the paradox Ivan had created. The more ruthlessly he controlled his state, the less capable it became. Military disaster made this impossible to ignore. In 1571, Crimean Tatar forces reached Moscow and burned large parts of the city. The capital of Ivan's terror state went up in flames not because it was weak in authority, but because it was hollow in function. The Oprichniki, designed to crush internal enemies, proved useless against an external one. For a ruler obsessed with betrayal, this was devastating. The city burned while his system stood watching. Ivan responded the only way he knew how, not with reform, but with more suspicion. Someone had failed. Someone had allowed this. Someone must be punished. But now the targets were harder to identify. The Oprichnina had already consumed most obvious enemies. What remained were loyal servants, frightened officials, and a czar who could no longer tell the difference. This is where Ivan's isolation became complete. He withdrew more often, physically and emotionally. He trusted almost no one. Even those who had survived years of terror did not feel safe, because survival itself had become suspicious. If you were still alive, perhaps it meant you had hidden something well. Ivan began to read silence as conspiracy and exhaustion as deception. The absence of resistance did not reassure him, it alarmed him. Why was no one challenging him? Why was no one plotting openly? What were they waiting for? Terror had removed feedback. And without feedback, Ivan's mind turned inward. The violence did not stop. It lost direction. Punishments became less strategic and more erratic. Old accusations resurfaced without context. Minor infractions were treated as existential threats. The line between state security and personal rage blurred further with each passing year. Ivan's moods grew unpredictable. Periods of religious devotion alternated with explosive cruelty. He fasted, prayed, confessed, then ordered executions with renewed intensity. Religion no longer restrained him, it validated him. He saw himself as both sinner and instrument, punishing the wicked while begging God for forgiveness after the fact. This cycle deepened his isolation. No advisor could safely interrupt it, no priest could challenge it. Anyone who tried risked becoming proof of the very threat they questioned. By the time the Oprichnina was formally dissolved in 1572, the damage was irreversible. The system ended not because Ivan rejected terror, but because terror had exhausted its usefulness. It had destroyed too much and protected too little. The state could no longer sustain it. But dissolving the Oprichnina did not restore trust. It only removed the uniform. Fear remained embedded in the culture, the court, and Ivan himself. The most tragic consequence of this collapse was personal. Ivan was no longer surrounded by rivals. He was surrounded by echoes. People spoke to him in reflections of his own fear. They confirmed his worst assumptions because disagreement was fatal. The ruler who had once believed he needed terror to see the truth now lived in a world where truth could no longer reach him. Power had finally achieved what no enemy ever could. It had sealed him off. This is the final irony of Ivan's reign. He began as a child desperate for safety. He built a system designed to eliminate uncertainty, and he ended as a ruler who could no longer tell what was real. The country suffered, but it survived. Ivan, trapped inside his own creation, did not. By the end of Part 5, even the terrible is no longer the architect of terror at its height. He is its prisoner, isolated, mistrustful, and ruling a state that obeys him perfectly while quietly falling apart beneath his feet. What remains is one final act, not of policy, not of system, but of irreversible human tragedy. In the final part, we will see how a man who turned fear into law ultimately turned it inward, and how the last victim of Ivan's reign was not a city or a noble house, but the future itself. Ivan the Terrible did not die at the height of his power. He died after it had already destroyed what it was meant to protect. By the late 1570s, the machinery of terror was mostly gone. The Oprichnina had been dissolved, the uniforms disappeared, the rituals ended. On paper, Russia was returning to something recognizable as a state. But nothing essential had been repaired. Fear had outlived the system that created it. Ivan's court no longer resembled a center of government. It was an echo chamber. Advisors spoke carefully, repeating what they believed the Tsar already thought. Silence was safer than disagreement. Agreement was safer than truth. Ivan listened and heard only confirmation. Years of ruling through suspicion had stripped him of the one thing no ruler can afford to lose: reliable reality. Information reached him distorted, filtered by terror. Warnings arrived too late or not at all. Praise came endlessly, but meant nothing. The ruler who had once believed fear revealed truth now lived inside a fog of his own making. His mental state deteriorated, not in spectacle, but in erosion. Ivan oscillated between extreme religious devotion and sudden cruelty. He fasted for days, prayed obsessively, confessed his sins in long rituals, then emerged convinced that punishment was not only permitted, but required. In his mind, suffering cleansed. Violence balanced the scales. God had become the final witness to his rule, and Ivan feared that witness almost as much as he feared his people. The state staggered forward under the weight of this instability. War dragged on. Resources were exhausted. Trust was absent. The machinery of rule still functioned, but without initiative, without resilience. Russia survived because societies often do. Ivan did not. The final tragedy was not political. It was intimate. In 1581, during an argument, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. Accounts vary on the details, but the result does not. The blow was fatal. The heir collapsed, blood spread across the floor. And suddenly, the Tsar, who had ordered countless deaths, was confronted with one he could not justify. For the first time, terror did not feel like control. It felt like loss. Ivan is said to have cradled his dying son, screaming in horror, begging God to reverse what had already happened. The moment shattered the logic that had sustained him for decades. The enemy had not been a boyar, not a city, not a conspiracy. It had been his own reflex to strike first. The same instinct that had shaped his reign had now destroyed his future. After that moment, Ivan never recovered. He grew increasingly withdrawn, physically frail, mentally unstable. Paranoia did not vanish, it turned inward. Where once he suspected others, he now suspected fate, God, history itself. The throne remained. The crown remained. But the line of succession was broken. Ivan had won every battle against imagined enemies and lost the only one that mattered. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, he left behind a weakened state and a traumatized society. But his most enduring legacy was not institutional, it was psychological. He demonstrated how fear can be elevated into law, how suspicion can replace evidence, how terror can feel like order until it consumes the one who wields it. This is why Ivan matters. Not because he was uniquely cruel, but because he shows us something far more uncomfortable, that a ruler does not need to be insane to build a nightmare. He only needs to believe absolutely that fear tells the truth. In the end, Ivan was not destroyed by rebellion. He was not overthrown. He was not defeated in war. He was undone by the same force he trusted more than anything else: fear. And the final victim of Ivan the Terrible's reign was not Russia. It was Ivan himself. Ivan the Terrible believed fear revealed the truth. In the end, it only revealed himself. If this series changed how you see power, control, or history, leave a comment with the word fear. And subscribe to CHRONOS History TV, where history isn't told to comfort you, but to confront you.